Hi BookTube, it's Amy, and I'm here to talk about Anthony Trollope's novel Barchester Towers that I finished reading this morning. Now, just a quick warning, if you haven't read the first novel in this series, The Warden, you may come across some spoilers in my discussion of this novel. So I'll leave it up to you whether you want to continue watching or not, but there are aspects of this novel that will reveal what happens in The Warden. Okay, so this novel picks up just a couple short years after the end of The Warden. Now, you'll remember in The Warden that Eleanor, the daughter of Mr. Harding, had recently married. She married at the end of that novel, and Mr. Harding had resigned the wardenship and gone back to a smaller income. Now, when this novel opens, Eleanor is a widow with a young 2-year-old son, and Mr. Harding is still living on that small income. But at the beginning of this novel, the bishop dies, leaving that position open and leading to it being filled by Dr. Prudy, and also, in a way, his wife, Mrs. Prudy, who exudes quite a bit of influence over her husband. And they come to Barchester from London, bringing with them the bishop's private chaplain, Mr. Slope, who is really the catalyst for all the misunderstandings and mischievous things that happen within this novel. So Mr. Slope is set upon winning the influence battle over the bishop against the bishop's wife, Mrs. Prudy. And so they are kind of butting heads and trying to convince the bishop to do what it is they want. And one of the chief things they are fighting over is filling this wardenship. It has been decided that the wardenship will have a reduced income and that the hospital, the wardenship is to look after this hospital where 12 older gentlemen were living. The wardenship will now be expanded, and this hospital will have 12 old men and 12 old women. And the idea is that they are looked after here in their old age by a pension that is paid to them, and they're also allowed to live within this hospital, and the role of the warden is to look after them. It also comes with a fine house, and this fine house is where Eleanor, also referred to as Mrs. Bold in this novel, is where Eleanor grew up with her father, Mr. Harding. And so this wardenship is open, and Mr. Slope at first wants a certain Mr. Quiverful to get the position. This is a man who is living in the country with 14 children on a very small income. And Mrs. Prudy is also in favor of this man getting the wardenship. But Mr. Slope soon changes his mind and sets about to meddle when he realizes that Eleanor, who is quite beautiful, is also a widow with a large income. And so Mr. Slope sets out to win her over. And everyone sees just how greasy and slimy Mr. Slope is. He is greatly disliked, except for Eleanor, who sees only the best in him because he shows to her a certain side of himself that is charming. And it's quite scathing the way that the narrator talks about Mr. Slope, because the narrator does not like Mr. Slope, but it's quite comedic because Mr. Slope is described as being able to charm women, but not having the same skills with men. At one point, Mr. Slope is even described as being greasy, of having greasy manners. And so Eleanor is deceived, and Mr. Slope is trying to win her over to marry her for her money. And so you've got all this going on, and then the deanship of a cathedral becomes vacant, and Mr. Slope would like to win that position for himself. And so you have all these power and social dynamics going on, and Eleanor has Mr. Slope as a suitor, but also 2 other suitors she is very much pursued. And so you have that romance angle, you have the power dynamics, and you have these positions that need to be filled. And then, of course, you have Mr. Harding, unsure whether he actually wants to regain a higher position. And in the midst of all this, you have parties and social gatherings going on. We have Miss Thorne and Mr. Thorne, who actually make an appearance in the next novel in this series called Dr. Thorne, which I haven't read that one yet, but I have seen a mini-series, so I do know the plot. You have the Thorns playing a role here, and at one point they host quite a fun party for everybody who lives on their land and rents from them, but also for a lot of their acquaintances. And so you really have two parties going on. You have what the renters and the people in the lower classes refer to as the quality, and then you have the lower classes. And the lower classes are out on the lawn. Miss Thorne has arranged games and whatnot for them. They have a different set of food, a different set of, social interactions that are going on. And then you have inside the house, you have the upper classes, the people of quality, having a party at the same time with better food. And obviously they cannot intermingle, but you have this hilarious woman with her daughters who shows up, and her name is literally Mrs. Lookaloft. Lookafts. Lookalofts. And so it's quite a funny play on words. She's looking aloft or looking aloof. But she shows up, and she is of the lower classes. But she has tried to better herself, tried to make herself look upper class, even though she's just a renter on the Thorns' land. And she is dressed in silks. She and her daughters are outfitted in these low-cut gowns with their bosoms showing. And I might add, it's the morning, so that is quite improper, I suppose, to be showing that much chest area in the morning. And she shows up, even though she's been invited to the party on the lawn with the lower classes. She shows up with her daughters, and they barge their way into the upper class party. And of course, Miss Thorne is too polite to turn them away, but they are received with very chilly manners. But it's quite hilarious because even the doorman doesn't know what to do. The footman, he doesn't know what to do. He's sort of stunned by these women who show up in their low-cut gowns with their long gloves and silks, looking quite proper as though they're going to an evening party, and he doesn't know how to turn them away. And so they end up in this party with the bishops and the bishop and the archdeacon and all the upper classes. And of course, all the women are dressed quite properly in proper morning gowns. They're not described in detail, but I would imagine, the necks would be up to here given the era. They certainly weren't showing off their shoulders and bosoms at that hour. And just their manners, this whole scene, it was delightful to read, and I wish that I got to see more of them. I did a quick Google of Mrs. Lookaloft, and unfortunately it doesn't seem as though there is a novel entirely devoted to them, but I sort of wish there was, because I'm sure it would be quite an entertaining read. And then, of course, in this novel, we have some very cringy yet enjoyable scenes with Mr. Slope when he is making advances to Eleanor. And she is quite horrified at a certain point, and I won't reveal to you what she does, but she is also horrified at her own behavior in this situation, and she's outraged and she's in tears, and she runs off away from Mr. Slope only to run into another one of her suitors who she also doesn't want to entertain. And then, of course, being a Trollope novel, one of the suitors she does appreciate, and it ends, of course, with everybody living happily ever after, who deserves, in the narrator's opinion, to live happily ever after. And Eleanor is happy, her father is happy, her brother-in-law is happy, her sister is happy, everybody is happy except, of course, for one of her suitors. And, you know, Mr. Slope is just slimy, and so you can already guess that he may win some and he may lose some in this novel, but he is not much endeared by many people at all. So that is Barchester Towers. And I admit, because I had seen several years back the BBC miniseries based on this novel with Alan Rickman, I did have some difficulty in the latter, well, in the earlier parts of the novel and in the latter parts as well, feeling the sort of disdain I think Trollope wants us to feel for Mr. Slope. I think we are certainly meant to despise him, but because I had seen him played by Alan Rickman, and I'm a big fan of Alan Rickman, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the character and almost want him to win out in some of these situations. But I think that was not the intention of Trollope. I think we are supposed to despise him and to root for Mr. Harding and Mrs. Grantley and Dr. Grantley, Eleanor's sister and brother-in-law, and for Eleanor herself against Mr. Slope. We're supposed to root, I think, for the bishop, for the Prudies as well, but that is a little bit harder to do because the bishop is portrayed almost as utterly stupid and almost weak-willed at the beginning of the novel, and at the mercy of his wife and at the mercy of Mr. Slope. Overall, it was a very enjoyable novel, something I definitely recommend, although I think you should certainly read The Warden first if for some reason you've gotten this far in my discussion and you haven't, because you really come to know a lot of the characters in this novel through The Warden. I think it's difficult to understand the character of Mr. Harding and certainly the character of Eleanor without having first read The Warden. And I absolutely love The Warden, but I think Barchester Towers was better. So I'll leave that here. I'm definitely going to be continuing on with the series by reading Dr. Thorne, and I'll let you know how I like that when I get started on that one.